They put up a sign at the edge of my town that read private community, authorized access only, and somehow, my name wasn't on the list. The metal gate groaned as it slid shut in front of my truck, the sound echoing across Main Street like something final, something deliberate. And for a second, I just sat there with my hand still on the steering wheel, engine idling, staring at a place I'd driven through my entire life, like it had suddenly forgotten who I was. The smell of fresh asphalt still hanging in the air, sharp and chemical, mixing with the familiar dust of a town that used to belong to people who actually lived in it, not people who showed up with paperwork and matching polo shirts. A security guard in a pressed uniform stepped out from the shade of a brand new booth that hadn't been there a week ago, clipboard tucked under his arm like he'd been practicing this moment, like he'd been waiting for me specifically. And when he knocked on my window, his knuckles made this dull, hollow sound against the glass that didn't match the place I grew up in, didn't match the gravel roads, or the creak of old porch boards, or the hum of pickup trucks rolling past at 35 miles per hour. ID and access permit, he said, like it was routine, like it was normal to ask a man for permission to enter his own street. I remember the way the heat pressed down on the hood, waves rising off the pavement, the way the new white lines on the road looked too clean, too straight, like someone had taken a ruler to something that was never meant to be measured. And I remember thinking this wasn't just construction. This wasn't just some upgrade project. This was control. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 weeks ago, this town didn't have gates, didn't have guards, didn't have anyone telling you where you could or couldn't drive, because the roads, the water lines, the grid beneath all of it, those things weren't built by committees or managed by some out-of-state HOA board with a logo and a slogan. They were built piece by piece, permit by permit, by people like my father and his father before him. And if you followed those lines far enough, if you dug deep enough into the records, nobody bothers to read anymore. They all led back to one name, mine. But standing there that morning, watching a stranger flip through a clipboard that didn't include me, I didn't say any of that. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't point at the house just half a mile down the road where I learned how to fix a broken pipe before I was old enough to drive. Because sometimes the worst thing you can do in a situation like that is react too early. And I could already see it in the details, in the brand new signage bolted into concrete that hadn't even fully cured, in the temporary permits zip-tied to posts like they were hoping nobody would look too closely, in the way the guard avoided eye contact for just a second too long, like he knew something didn't quite add up. That's when I noticed the name printed across the top of his clipboard in bold black letters. Hargrove Community Management, and just beneath it, smaller, almost like an afterthought, the words Willow Creek Township Jurisdiction Zone, like they'd already decided what this place was called now, like they'd already rewritten something that had existed long before they ever showed up. I leaned back in my seat, the engine humming low, steady, familiar, and I gave a small nod like I understood, like I accepted it, even though every inch of that moment felt wrong. Because what they didn't know, what Victoria Hargrove didn't know when she sent her people to put up fences around a town she thought was unclaimed, was that ownership isn't always visible, it isn't always loud. And sometimes the strongest control isn't the one that shows up with signs and guards, it's the one buried underneath everything, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone exactly who built the ground they're standing on. I killed the engine, and just sat there for a second longer than necessary, letting the silence settle in, because I knew the moment I stepped out of that truck, everything was going to feel different, like I was walking into someone else's version of a place I used to know by heart. And that thought alone had a weight to it that no sign or gate could match. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the heat hitting me full in the face, carrying that same sharp scent of fresh tar and drying paint, the kind of smell that tells you something new has been forced into existence overnight, something that does not belong yet, but is trying very hard to pretend it does. Gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped forward, a familiar sound in an unfamiliar setting, and I could feel the guard watching me, waiting for some kind of reaction, maybe expecting frustration, maybe expecting an argument, but I gave him neither. "There is no permit for this address," he said, flipping through his pages again, slower this time, like the answer might change if he looked hard enough, and I nodded like I was just another guy who had taken a wrong turn, even though the mailbox down the road still had my last name carved into it from 20 years ago. I took a few steps back, glanced at the gate, at the hinges bolted into concrete that still showed damp patches around the edges, at the security camera mounted just a little too low, angled more for intimidation than actual coverage, and I started noticing patterns, small things most people would miss, like the temporary wiring running from the booth into a portable junction box, like the permit sticker that had a date that did not line up with the county's standard approval timeline, like the way the barrier arm stuttered slightly when it moved, as if it had been installed in a hurry. That was when I understood this was not finished, not properly, not legally, just quickly, just confidently, the way people build things when they believe no one is going to question them. I reached into my truck, pulled out the old folder that never really leaves the passenger seat, the one filled with folded maps and copies of documents that most people would have thrown away years ago, paper worn soft at the edges from being handled too many times, ink slightly faded, but still readable if you knew what you were looking for. And I did not open it yet. I just held it there for a moment, feeling the weight of it, remembering why I kept it in the first place. My father used to say that land is not just what you see on the surface, it is everything underneath. Every pipe, every line, every right-of-way that nobody thinks about until something stops working, and standing there in front of a gate that was not supposed to exist, I could almost hear his voice again, calm, steady, telling me to look deeper before I acted. The guard cleared his throat, a little louder this time, like he was trying to regain control of a situation he did not fully understand, and I gave him a small, polite smile before turning back toward my truck. "I will come back," I said, simple, neutral, like I had accepted his authority for now, and I could see the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction, like he thought this was over, like he thought he had done his job. But as I drove away, tires rolling slowly over a road that still technically belonged to me, I was already mapping it out in my head, every connection, every access point, every piece of infrastructure that tied this town together beneath the surface. And for the first time since that gate came down in front of me, I felt something shift, not anger, not frustration, but clarity, because they had built their control on top of something they did not own, and the moment I decided to stop ignoring that fact, the clock started ticking. I did not go home that day, not right away, because there is a difference between reacting and responding, and I had learned a long time ago that the second one always wins if you give it enough time to breathe. So instead I drove past the old water tower on the east side, the one most people think is just a landmark, rusted edges catching the afternoon light. But I know better. I know what runs beneath it. I know where the main line splits and how far that pressure carries when the system is fully open. And as I parked just off the gravel shoulder, I could hear the faint hum beneath the ground, steady, reliable, unchanged by whatever sign they decided to bolt at the entrance of town. The air smelled different out here, cleaner, less touched by whatever rushed construction had been going on near the main road. And for a moment it felt like the place I remembered, like the version of Willow Creek that still existed under all the noise. Waiting quietly, I stepped out, boots hitting packed dirt this time instead of fresh pavement, and walked toward the base of the tower where an old access panel sat locked behind a weathered steel door, paint chipped, hinges worn but still holding, and I ran my hand along the surface, feeling the rough texture, the kind that only comes from decades of use, not weeks of installation. Most people would not look twice at something like this, but to me it was as clear as a blueprint. Every bolt, every seal, every line connected to something bigger, something that had never been transferred, never been rewritten, no matter what paperwork someone printed last month. I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, just to open a set of scanned documents I had digitized years ago, files labeled in a way that only made sense to me. Dates going back to the late 1970s, survey maps layered over infrastructure plans, all tied to a name that had been on record long before any homeowners association ever thought about expanding into this county. My father used to keep these in a metal cabinet in the garage, right next to his tools, like they were just another part of the job, and I remember asking him once why he never threw them out, why he kept records nobody seemed to care about anymore, and he just looked at me and said, "Because the day someone pretends this does not exist is the day it matters most." Standing there, looking at the same lines he showed me when I was barely tall enough to see over the workbench, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Back at the gate, they had control on the surface, guards, permits, authority printed in bold letters. But out here, under 30 feet of soil and rock, Control followed a completely different set of rules, ones that did not change just because someone decided they owned a town. I zoomed in on one section of the map, tracing the main distribution line as it cut straight through the center of Willow Creek, branching off into every street, every house, every business that now sat behind that new barrier, and I could feel that same quiet clarity settle in again, stronger this time, sharper, because this was not just about access anymore. It was about dependency. They had claimed the town, but they were standing on top of a system they did not understand, using resources they did not control. And the more I looked at the details, the more obvious it became that they had not just overstepped, they had built their entire operation on an assumption that nobody would ever challenge them. I locked the screen, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and took one last look at the tower before heading back to my truck. The sun dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the ground. And for the first time since that gate came down in front of me, I was not thinking about how to get back in. I was thinking about how long it would take before they realized they were never really in control to begin with. The next morning, I walked into the county records office before the doors had even fully opened, the fluorescent lights still flickering to life overhead, casting that cold, sterile glow across rows of filing cabinets that smelled faintly of paper, dust, and time. The kind of place where truth does not disappear, it just waits for someone patient enough to dig it back up. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I signed in, her coffee steaming beside a stack of forms, the soft scratch of my pen against the logbook louder than it should have been in the quiet room, and I could feel that same steady focus settling in again, the kind that comes when you stop guessing and start confirming. I asked for everything tied to Willow Creek Township infrastructure permits, not recent filings, not summaries, everything. And she gave me that look people give when they think you are about to waste your own time, then disappeared into the back without a word. Minutes later, I was sitting at a long wooden table with a stack of documents that felt heavier than they looked, each page carrying decades of decisions, approvals, and signatures that most people would never think to question. I flipped through them slowly, not rushing, because details like this do not reveal themselves to people in a hurry, and it did not take long before the pattern started to show itself. Dates that lined up, approvals that referenced original construction authorities, and most importantly, a name that never changed, not once, not in 50 years, Coal Infrastructure Holdings, the legal entity my grandfather had set up when this place was still just open land and a handful of dirt roads. I could almost hear the hum of the water lines again as I traced the routes on the map spread out in front of me, each one stamped, each one recorded, each one still valid because nothing in these files showed a full transfer of ownership, no signed release, no reassignment of control, just temporary service agreements that had long since expired but were apparently being treated like permanent authority by people who either did not know better or hoped nobody else did. I leaned back in the chair, wood creaking under the shift, and let that sink in for a second, because this was not a loophole, this was a foundation, something solid enough to hold up everything they thought they owned, and something they had clearly never bothered to verify. I kept digging, moving from water to road access, then to utility easements, each file confirming the same thing in a slightly different way, like a system designed to be redundant so it could never be erased by a single mistake. And by the time I reached the final set of documents, there it was, the clause most people would skip right past, buried in language that sounded routine unless you understood exactly what it meant. Full operational control of all primary infrastructure remains with the original developer unless explicitly transferred under signed and recorded agreement, and there was no such agreement anywhere in the stack. The air felt different after that, heavier but clearer, like everything had just shifted into place, and I closed the folder carefully, not slamming it, not drawing attention, just letting it rest there for a moment, as if it were any other file in any other office, even though I knew it was the exact piece they had overlooked when they decided to claim something they did not build. I signed out, nodded to the clerk on my way past, and stepped back into the morning light, the sun already climbing, heat rising off the pavement in soft waves. And as I walked toward my truck, I pulled out my phone and opened a new draft, fingers steady, typing out the first formal notice, not emotional, not aggressive, just precise, referencing statutes, ownership, and jurisdiction in a way that leaves no room for interpretation, because this was not about arguing anymore. This was about activating something that had been in place long before Victoria Hargrove ever printed her first sign. And as I hit save and looked up at the road leading back toward that gate, I realized something simple and absolute. They did not just misunderstand this town. They built their entire authority on top of a system that legally still belonged to me. And the moment I decided to stop letting them use it without permission, everything they had created would start to come apart on its own. I sent the notice at exactly 9:12 that morning, not because the time mattered legally, but because precision has a way of setting the tone before anyone even reads the first line. And I made sure every word in that document carried weight without raising its voice, referencing statutes, ownership records, and operational authority in a way that did not ask for permission or invite discussion. It simply stated what already existed, what had always existed, and what would happen next if it continued to be ignored. The confirmation email came back almost instantly, a clean digital receipt with a timestamp and a delivery record, and I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, knowing that this was the moment things officially shifted from quiet observation to controlled action. By noon, I was parked just outside the edge of town again, not at the main gate this time, but along a side access road that had not been fully secured yet, watching from a distance as the new system they had put in place tried to function like something permanent, even though I already knew it was built on borrowed ground. The guard at the front looked more alert today, posture tighter, movements sharper, like he had been given new instructions, and when a black SUV pulled up to the booth, the window rolled down just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her for the first time, Victoria Hargrove, exactly as I expected, composed, polished, the kind of presence that fills a space without raising its volume, sunglasses catching the light as she spoke to the guard without even stepping out of the vehicle, her hand making small, precise gestures that suggested control, authority, ownership, even though I knew none of those things were actually hers to claim. The barrier lifted smoothly for her, no hesitation, no question, and she drove through like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. And I almost smiled at that, not because it impressed me, but because it confirmed something important. She believed this was already settled, already secured, already hers. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel shifting under my boots again, that familiar crunch grounding me in a way nothing else could, and I took a slow walk along the edge of the road, eyes moving over the details they had added, new signage, freshly painted curbs, temporary fencing that tried to look permanent if you did not look too closely, and I could see the seams everywhere, the rushed decisions, the assumptions layered on top of each other, all of it designed to project certainty instead of actually establishing it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a response notification, and I did not need to open it right away to know what it would say, but I did anyway, pulling it out, screen bright against the afternoon sun, and there it was, a short, formal reply from Hargrove Community Management, acknowledging receipt of my notice and dismissing it in the same breath, citing their own authority, their own permits, their own interpretation of jurisdiction, all written in that same confident tone that assumes the other side does not have anything real to stand on. I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of their certainty before I dismantled it piece by piece. And when I finally locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket, the faint hum beneath the ground felt louder somehow, like a reminder, steady and patient. I turned back toward my truck, the sun dipping just enough to stretch shadows across the road, and as I reached for the door handle, I could already see the next steps lining up in my head, filings, notices, timed actions that would not hit all at once, but would start to apply pressure in exactly the right places, because this was never going to be about one big moment. It was going to be about a sequence, controlled, deliberate, unavoidable. They had responded exactly how I expected, with confidence built on incomplete understanding. And that was the one thing I needed them to do, because the more certain they were, the less prepared they would be for what came next. And as I started the engine and pulled away, I did not feel like I was trying to get back into the town anymore. I felt like I was giving them time to realize they had already stepped into something they could not control, and the countdown had officially begun. By the third day, the town started to feel the shift, not in a dramatic way, not the kind that makes headlines or draws attention, but in small, precise disruptions that most people would not notice unless they were paying very close attention. and I knew exactly where to apply them because I had spent years understanding how everything beneath the surface connected. It started with paperwork, quiet filings submitted to the county and state utility oversight offices, each one referencing the same core issue: unauthorized use of privately owned infrastructure, each one backed by documentation that could not be ignored without someone risking their own position, and I spaced them out deliberately, not all at once, just enough to create a pattern that would force a response. The confirmation notices came in throughout the day: emails, stamped acknowledgments, automated responses that might look routine to anyone else, but to me they were markers, each one another step in a process that does not move fast, but does not stop once it starts. By the afternoon, I drove past the outer edge again, slower this time, windows down, letting the air move through the cab, carrying that faint mix of fresh paint and something else now, something less stable, like the system they had built was already starting to strain. Under questions it was not prepared to answer. At the main gate, the guard was different, younger, less certain, his posture not quite as rigid, and when a delivery truck pulled up, I watched the hesitation play out in real time. The driver leaning out, asking questions, the guard flipping through pages that suddenly did not seem as complete as they did before, and it took longer than it should have for that barrier to lift. That was the first visible crack. I kept driving, circling around to the service road that fed into the maintenance side of town, the part nobody decorates or advertises, where utility boxes sit in plain sight and lines run just a few feet below ground. And I parked near one of the older access points, the metal cover slightly warped from years of use, bolts worn smooth by time. I did not open it, I did not need to, just standing there was enough, because I knew exactly what it controlled, exactly how far its reach extended, and more importantly, I knew it was still registered under the same authority it had always been. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this one not from the HOA, but from a regional compliance office requesting clarification on a permit discrepancy, the first external question triggered by the filings I had sent, and I could not help the small nod that followed, because this was how it worked, not fast, not loud, but once the right questions started being asked, they spread, they multiplied. They forced people to look where they had not looked before. Later that evening, I saw Victoria again, this time outside the gate, standing next to her SUV, phone pressed to her ear, her movements sharper now, less composed, one hand gesturing toward the guard booth as if trying to fix something that was no longer entirely under her control, and even from a distance, I could tell the tone had shifted, not panic, not yet, but irritation mixed with something else, something closer to uncertainty. I stayed in the shadows of the road, engine off, just watching, because this part matters, this moment when someone who thought they had absolute authority starts to realize there are systems they do not understand, forces they cannot manage with a clipboard and a title. The lights along the entrance flickered on as the sun dropped below the horizon, casting long beams across the pavement, and for a second, the whole place looked polished again, controlled, like nothing had changed, but I knew better, because underneath that surface, the process had already begun, and it was not something they could stop by denying it or dismissing it. I leaned back in the seat, the faint hum beneath the ground still steady, still mine, and as I watched the gate close behind another delayed entry, I realized the first phase was working exactly as planned, not by breaking anything, but by forcing everything to prove it had the right to exist, and that was a test I already knew they could not pass. By the end of the first week, the town was still standing exactly the way it looked on the surface, clean lines, fresh paint, gates opening and closing on schedule, but underneath that polished exterior, the pressure had started to build in ways that could not be smoothed over with confidence or better signage, and I could see it every time I drove past, every time I slowed down just enough to watch how long it took for simple things to happen. Deliveries that used to take minutes were now delayed. Service trucks were being turned around because their permits did not match the new system, and even residents, people who had lived there for years, were starting to hesitate at the entrance, fumbling through new rules that did not quite make sense, and that hesitation, that small pause before compliance, it spread faster than anything else. I kept my distance, never approaching the gate directly, never forcing a confrontation, because this stage was not about me being seen, it was about them being questioned, and every filing I had submitted was now working its way through channels that do not move quickly, but but do not forget once they start moving. My phone had become a steady rhythm of notifications, not urgent, not dramatic, just consistent, requests for clarification, notices of review, small administrative acknowledgments that most people would ignore, but that I tracked carefully, because each one meant another layer of their authority was being examined by someone outside their control. One afternoon, I parked near the old service junction again, the one most people drive past without even noticing, and I watched as a county vehicle pulled up near the main road. Two officials stepping out with clipboards that looked a lot more official than anything the HOA had printed, their movements measured, deliberate, the kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself to be recognized. They spoke to the guard briefly, not arguing, not raising their voices, just asking questions, pointing at documents, and even from a distance, I could see the difference in posture, the guard no longer certain, no longer in control, flipping through his pages like they might suddenly provide answers they had never been designed to give. That was when I saw Victoria again, stepping out of her vehicle with that same controlled energy, but this time it did not hold the same certainty, her movements sharper, her expression tighter, like someone who had just realized the rules she had been relying on were no longer the only ones in play. She spoke with the officials for a few minutes, gestures precise, voice likely steady. But there was something missing now, something that had been there before, that absolute confidence that comes from believing you are untouchable. And as the conversation ended, I watched her pause for just a fraction of a second longer than before, as if recalculating, as if trying to understand how something she had already claimed could suddenly be questioned. I leaned back in my seat, the late afternoon sun cutting across the dashboard, warming the worn leather beneath my hands, and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, because this was the moment the shift became visible, not just to me, but to anyone paying attention. They had built control on top of assumptions, on the belief that no one would challenge the foundation, and now that foundation was being examined piece by people who did not care about appearances or authority, only about what was actually valid. I started the engine, the familiar rumble grounding me again, and as I pulled away, I could already see how the next phase would unfold, not as a single collapse, but as a series of small, undeniable corrections, each one stripping away a layer of control until there was nothing left to hold it together. And for the first time since this started, I knew they were no longer in a position to dismiss what was coming, because the system they depended on had already begun to turn against them. By the second week, the cracks were no longer subtle. They were visible in the rhythm of the town itself, in the way systems that used to run without thought now required constant attention, constant explanation, constant correction, and the more they tried to tighten control, the more obvious it became that they were managing symptoms instead of understanding the cause. I drove through the outer roads again just after sunrise, the air cooler, carrying that faint metallic scent that always lingers when infrastructure is under strain, and I could hear it even before I saw it. The low, uneven hum beneath the ground, not broken, not failing, just being pushed in ways it was never designed to handle without proper oversight. At the main entrance, a small line had formed, nothing dramatic, just 3 or 4 vehicles waiting longer than they should have. Engines idling, drivers leaning out of windows asking questions that did not have simple answers anymore. And the guard, the same young one from before, moved with a kind of cautious uncertainty now, double-checking lists, making calls, no longer operating with the confidence of someone who believes the system behind him is complete. I stayed back, parked along the shoulder where the road curved just enough to give me a clear view without being noticed, and I watched as a service van was turned away, the driver shaking his head, pointing at paperwork that apparently no longer matched whatever rules had been put in place. And that moment, that small refusal, carried more weight than any argument ever could, because it showed exactly what was happening. The structure they had created was starting to reject the very functions it needed to survive. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was different, not a routine acknowledgement, not a request for clarification, but an official notice of temporary compliance review, issued by the State Utility Board, referencing the filings I had submitted and the discrepancies that had now been independently confirmed, and I read it slowly, every word measured, every line reinforcing the same simple truth. Their authority was being audited by people who did not answer to them. Later that day, I saw Victoria standing outside the gate again, but this time there was no vehicle to shield her, No controlled environment, just open pavement and a cluster of residents gathered nearby, their posture tense, voices low but persistent, asking questions she could not deflect with a simple policy or a printed notice. She held herself steady. I will give her that, shoulders squared, voice likely calm. But even from a distance I could see the shift, the way her responses had to stretch further now, had to cover gaps that were no longer hidden, and every answer she gave seemed to create two more questions behind it. I stepped out of the truck for a moment, letting my boots hit the pavement, feeling the heat rise from the road. And I took a slow look at everything they had built over the past weeks, the signs, the barriers, the polished image of control, and for the first time it looked temporary, not because it was physically weak, but because it was no longer supported by anything solid underneath. I checked my watch without thinking, not because I needed to know the time, but because I was tracking something else entirely, the sequence, the timeline, the way each action was stacking on top of the last, and I knew we were getting close to the point where the system would not just be questioned, it would be corrected. I got back into the truck, the seat warm from the sun, and as I started the engine, I allowed myself a brief moment to acknowledge what was coming next, not a confrontation, not a dramatic showdown, but something far more definitive, the kind of resolution that does not rely on emotion or argument, only on what is legally undeniable. And as I pulled away from the edge of town, I realized they were no longer trying to expand control. They were trying to hold on to it. And that is a position that rarely lasts when the foundation was never theirs to begin with. On the 30th day, the sign was still standing at the entrance, still clean, still bold, still declaring something that no longer had any legal ground beneath it. And I pulled up just before sunrise, the sky just starting to lighten, the air cool and still, carrying none of the tension that had built over the past few weeks, just quiet, like the town itself was waiting for something to settle. The gate was open, not broken, not forced, just left that way. The barrier arm raised like it no longer had a reason to come down, and there was no guard in the booth, just an empty chair and a clipboard sitting on the counter, pages flipped open to a list that no longer mattered. I stepped out of the truck slowly, boots hitting the pavement that had once felt unfamiliar but now felt exactly like it always had, and I walked past the sign without stopping, without even looking at it for more than a second, because it had already lost its authority before I ever got there. The official notice had been posted late the night before, not dramatic, not loud, just a standard court order, stamped, signed, and delivered through the same system that had been quietly building pressure from the moment I filed that first document. And it said exactly what it needed to say, that all enforcement actions, restrictions, and claims made by Hargrove Community Management within Willow Creek Township were to cease immediately pending full review, that no authority had been legally established over the infrastructure that supported the town, and that any continued attempt to operate as such would be considered a violation subject to further action. I had read it once when it came through, then again just to let it settle, but standing there now, seeing the result, I did not need to read it again to understand what it meant. The town was still here, the houses, the roads, the systems beneath it all still running the way they were designed to. But the layer that had been placed on top of it, the control, the assumption of ownership, that was gone, not in a dramatic collapse, not in some loud moment of failure, but in the quiet removal of something that was never properly connected in the first place. I walked down the main road, the early light stretching across the pavement, catching on windows and fences that looked exactly the way they had before all of this started, and for the first time in weeks, there was no hesitation at the entrance, no confusion, no extra step required to move through a place that had always been open. A few residents stepped out of their homes, some recognizing me, some just going about their morning routines, and there was a different kind of energy now, not celebration, not even relief exactly, just a return to something normal, something stable. I stopped for a moment near the center of town, right where the main line split beneath the road, and I could feel that same steady hum again, unchanged, unaffected by everything that had happened above it, and I let out a slow breath as I looked around, taking it all in without needing to say anything. Victoria was not there, not at the gate, not anywhere in sight, and I did not need to know where she went or what she was doing next, because this was never about her personally. It was about the structure she tried to impose, the authority she assumed without understanding what it rested on. I turned back toward my truck, the sun now fully above the horizon, light filling the town in a way that made everything look clear again. And as I reached for the door, I glanced once more at the entrance behind me, the sign still standing but already meaningless, and I realized something simple, something my father had understood long before I did. Power is not what you claim, it is what you can prove, and in the end, they did not lose to me. They lost to the foundation they never bothered to. Check.